Hello, everybody out there. This is George Grun Guitars, Nashville, Tennessee, April 1st. And the fact that I'm starting late is not an April Fool's joke, but they're tearing up to do utility lines in the alley right behind the building, which is next to the room where I normally do my sessions from. And the noise in there was so great that we had to move everything over to our library room, which is more in the middle of the building where we will not hear the jackhammering. So it would not have been a very successful session had we not moved. At any rate, here we are, April 1st, 2022. The market for guitars continues to be strong. In fact, at the recent Nashville Vintage Guitar Show, the Four Amigos show, there were lots of very high, rather optimistic asking prices, and some of them brought really high money. But frankly, most of what I saw out there didn't look like it had much potential for me to purchase anything for resale due to condition issues, price, and also simply a shortage of the right items for me. But those that did have premium quality instruments, sure enough, were successful at selling. So there was a demand from American as well as from a few Japanese buyers who were there buying for resale. But actually, it's very few Japanese buyers were there compared to some previous years, but the ones who were there were busy buying. And they were both mostly buying things that were not necessarily classic era, although some were. A lot of it was electric rather than acoustic, definitely rock and roll oriented for the Japanese buyers who were at the show, rather a different demographic than the Japanese buyers I was dealing with back in the 1970s and 80s, who were my own age and were interested in acoustic every bit as much, if not more so, than electric. And we're looking for things like pre-World War II Gibson and Martin acoustic guitars, as well as banjos and mandolins. I saw very little mandolin or banjo activity at the show. There were a few mandolins, but not many and not great ones. And so far as banjos, I did not see a single banjo at the show that I would have considered a truly high quality, genuinely collectible banjo out there. But that doesn't mean nobody wants banjos. It means that the guitar shows are not so much featuring them. And even the Vintage Magazine price guide doesn't do much these days to feature banjos. They don't seem to think that the market is big enough for them to do it. They'll devote more space to amplifiers or whatever. But we do have some questions that came in from the audience out there, and we can certainly use more questions. If we're going to fill an hour or more, we actually need more questions. So if you got any questions, by all means, send them on in and I will get to them. But for starters, Scott asks regarding our special model Martins, do you expect to get more of your style 18 sinker or your style 28 quadruple O Martins coming in? And the answer is yes. And this being April is a good time to ask that question, because the answer is that we are expecting a pretty considerable quantity of new Martins coming in this month. It's been a bit drier than usual so far as the backlog affecting us on receiving enough Martins. But in the past week, we've received 2 pallet loads of Martins. including some that will probably be on the list tonight on our inventory release blast, email blast. But there will be more coming in through the course of this month. So it's not just done with the 2 pallet loads. There's more coming in this month. And he asked also, do you have any plans for any more Style 42 custom quadruple O's? If so, when might we expect to see them? I'm not currently planning any more with the pearl or abalone trim on the front edge of the body, but we do have on order a moderate number with the Style 45 neck inlay and Style 28 herringbone type body ornamentation in both sinker and rosewood, and they will be dribbling in over the course of the year. Not as many as the Style 18s, but we also have a pretty good number of the Style 28 rosewood herringbone trim custom specials. And so we will be stocking considerably numbers of them. We've had them on order, some of them for as much as a year, but the flow from Martin is due to start picking up dramatically this month. We will be getting more. We've also received a considerable number of new tailors in, and Taylor will be stocking, sending us a lot more tailors this year for the remainder of the year and onward. So the drought there is also ending. Paul asks, you have mentioned in previous question and answer sessions that there's a healthy interest in new and vintage instruments amongst younger players. I'd be interested to know whether the younger guitarists age 30 and below are interested in the same vintage electric models as the baby boomers who grew up listening to Clapton, Bloomfield, and Hendrix. For example, do they have a greater interest in Jazz Masters and Jaguars, both models favored by indie bands, and old players who on the whole prefer Strats, Tellys, and Les Pauls? The answer to your question is that those today who are millennials born starting 1980, who now would be 42 years old and getting a second wind of buying, people tend to get imprinted on the type of music they like from puberty through about age 20. And then they may stick with that for the rest of their life. That doesn't mean they stick with exactly only the same tunes and they never grow. They do. But the basic type of music that they tend to like sticks with them so that they are interested in it puberty through age 25. And they may drop out for a while they're raising a family and upward mobility in their job. The standard line is the guy comes home and he's tired after a long day at work and he's got the expensive wife, children, house, upward mobility in his job. If he has enough energy to take the guitar or banjo or mandolin out of the case or plug in an electric guitar that makes enough noise to wake up the kids, which upsets the wife, who makes him put it back in the case, and he quits playing, unless he's a professional musician, in which case a high percentage of them get divorced. But at any rate, the people today who are middle-aged, 40 to 45 years old, are likely to have grown up with somewhat different musical preferences than the baby boomers. And yes, indeed, they do like a lot of the instruments that the indie bands liked. And that can produce sometimes strange results, like Kurt Cobain's Martin D18E electric in not the greatest condition, sold for over $6 million at auction. And the Pink Floyd Strat, David Gilmour's guitar, brought over $4 million at auction for a guitar made after 1970 that had been highly modified and pretty rough condition. But for a generation that is now heavily involved, that's still a big deal guitar. And even for some baby boomers, that's a big deal guitar. Pink Floyd was plenty popular among baby boomers, as well as among a lot of the millennials. So yes, there are differences. Today, Fender is doing very well with Jazzmasters and Jaguars, although they have actually, to their credit, upgraded them so that the switch system and the bridge and tremolo design is better on the new ones than it was on the originals. I think the reason why the Jazzmaster Jaguar didn't take off very much with the baby boomers who were interested in R&B is that those two models, the Jazzmaster and Jaguar, were really designed for the surfing sound or the Ventures type sound. It's two groups that use that type guitars. Prior to using Mosrites, the Ventures were using Jazzmasters, and they got their sound just fine, but the bridge design and the tremolo design on those models is somewhat unstable and not really giving as solid a tone either as you can get on a Tele or a Strat. But the new Fender Jazzmasters and Jaguars are very well set up where they do sound good. The switch systems make a bit more sense to most people, and the pickups are wound where they have a sound that suits most modern players. So yes, there are differences in preference. And yes, indeed, the style of music that appeals to people today in their 30s and early 40s is not necessarily the same as applied to the baby boomers. But then for that matter, the baby boomers grew up, at least 59 to 63 was a huge folk music boom of mostly acoustic. And then 64 through 68 was Beatles, Rolling Stones, and rock, the British invasion, which the British invasion was not R&B. It was a different sound entirely. So to say that all baby boomers preferred the same music is not true, because there were plenty of baby boomers who went from acoustic folk music to R&B, and then others who really started more with the Beatles and Stones and a totally different type sound. So not all baby boomers have the same preferences, and it makes a difference. Sometimes a 4-year period can be very different than the previous 4 years. So the millennials today, who are now, the oldest millennials are about 42, grew up hearing all the type music the baby boomers heard, plus music that came along later, but still within the time when their musical printing, their brain hardwiring was being set, not exactly in stone, but such that they'll have that preference for the rest of their life. They may not be very interested in banjos or mandolins, but they sure enough like guitars and music that is guitar related. And some of them indeed do like banjos and mandolins. Bluegrass has a pretty wide appeal, and bluegrass music itself is evolving. So the bluegrass music of Bill Monroe is joined by newgrass and by modern grass today that's different from the newgrass movement of the 70s. So bluegrass music today has elements of the early traditional bluegrass, plus a bit of jazz thrown in, plus these days, quite a variety where, for example, Daly and Vincent sound they really like the Statler Brothers, and some of the tunes they do are Statler Brothers tunes with that type of arrangements, but they still use bluegrass instrumentation and some of the bluegrass type vocalization mixed in. So Rhonda Vincent does lots of country tunes as well as bluegrass, but she does it with bluegrass type instrumentation. The preferences do change over the years. And that means that basically the music is still vibrantly alive. It's not fossilized. And that is good. I have preferences that are pretty firmly fixed in some ways, but I hear a lot of new music that I also like. I'm capable of learning new stuff. But a lot of what I still go back to, the music I play, and what I still prefer, a great deal of it, is the music that I was really interested in by the time I was 20. And that's true of people in general. And it's true for more than just music. It's the kind of sports that you enjoy, a lot of the kinds of art you like. A lot of that you know pretty well by the time you're 20, but you can learn and expand within that. And you can expand beyond that. A lot of the core interests are pretty firmly hardwired in the brain from puberty to about age 20. And that does impact the guitar market as well as numerous others. Herb has a comment. It says, I was saddened to hear of the recent passing of Alexander Dumble. There is an excellent article in the April issue of Vintage Guitar about his life. Did you know Mr. Dumble? Have any of his amps passed through your store? And if so, did they sound as amazing as everyone says? Could you comment on his impact on electric guitar amplification? Well, I did not know him personally. I knew of him. Yes, we've had a number of his amps go through, and we've sold them to some pretty notable performers, including Eric Clapton and Keith Urban. The one that Clapton bought was a console amp, just not a head and a speaker cabinet, but one unit. And frankly, I think it was one of the most amazing sounding amps I've ever heard. And I have a friend who's very knowledgeable about Eric's music to the point of he listened to Eric's concert in Texas, and then just barely a week later, Eric was in Nashville, and he flew up to Nashville specifically to hang out in Nashville and hear the Clapton concert again, and to visit a few friends in Nashville. But he told me that he thought Eric, he didn't know what caused it, but Eric's sound was a lot better in Nashville than it had been in Texas just the week before. And what I can tell you is Eric was playing through the Dumble. And even though the Dumble is still mic'd and goes through the PA, Dumble made some great amps. He'd also seal it all together so that nobody but him could service it. And he was not very open in sharing how he got that sound. But certainly there's enough people today who have a pretty good idea how those amps were wired. And yes, he certainly has had an impact. So he did show that it's possible to wire an amp and design it where it can do more than most of the traditional designs that preceded him. But he will be remembered, and he will still continue to have a lasting impact. His designs are not forgotten, but it's not simply that they're remembered and you can get it only in a Dumble amp. It has influenced others who make amps with similar wiring, so that it's not all a total deep, dark mystery. But are Dumble amps really, really good? The answer is absolutely yes, they are. Are there not others that might contend for being equally good these days? I would say that probably the answer to that is yes, but Dumble inspired people to realize that they could reach for a higher goal. And it did cause amp design in general to experiment and to come up with new ideas to produce some very traditional sounds as well as versatile application for new sounds. So that's about as much as I can easily say about Dumble. I don't know every secret of his wiring, but there are people who have studied them with great care and have a pretty good idea what he did. And his ideas are not simply lost. They do influence others today. Jeff writes, I was fortunate enough to acquire a Blue Ridge solid Brazilian rosewood guitar some years ago, a BR 260. I have read and agreed that other species of rosewood can be just as good or better than Brazilian. However, over the years, I am convinced there's something about Brazilian rosewood that explains the mystique that surrounds it. I believe I'm hearing overtones and harmonics not heard in other species of rosewood or any other wood used in the body and sides of a guitar. It just sounds fuller, more even in loudness across the tones sound spectrum. It's similar, but not nearly to that extreme as the difference between music heard over the telephone compared to a stereo. Have you noticed this? Or am I imagining it? Or is my hearing compromised due to age? Well, I don't know what your hearing is, but I can tell you that as people age, their hearing does change, and typically not for the better. They tend to lose a lot of the ability to hear some of the high frequency sounds. But there are numerous species of rosewood in the genus Dalbergia, Brazilian rosewood being the most highly esteemed. But even back in the 1930s, Hermann Hauser, who was one of the greatest classical guitar builders ever, used Brazilian and Indian rosewood, and the availability to him in Germany was such that he charged the same for a guitar with either Brazilian or Indian rosewood. Brazilian rosewood was readily available, as was Indian. And Hauser didn't distinguish in price or personal preference of one versus the other. But I think in general that Brazilian rosewood does give a very bell-like ring when you tap a piece of wood. If you can make xylophone bars out of it, and or marimba. Marimbas have wood bars rather than metal. At least the best ones do. But there are other woods that can also give an excellent tone. So Brazilian rosewood is not the only one that can do that. There's a great deal of mystique now, especially that it's on Appendix 1 of the CITES Treaty, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, that it is illegal to bring in for international trade Brazilian rosewood that was harvested after June 11th of 2011. If it can be proven that it was cut previous to that, and you can get certification of that, then it can be legal, but not without the certificate. And the certificate can be difficult to get. It means that most makers today are not using Brazilian because they're out of old wood that can be certified. My experience is I've heard some fabulous guitars with Indian rosewood. Gibson made the advanced jumbo guitar pre-war, and the earliest J200s with Indian rosewood. And there are also some Nick Lucas model Gibsons from the 30s that have Indian rosewood. They sound great. And I've heard some Brazilian rosewood early Gibsons from the early 30s that don't necessarily sound better than the ones with Indian rosewood. Indian rosewood is capable of great tone. We are not currently ordering any custom shop Martins with Brazilian rosewood because the price that Martin charges for a new guitar with Brazilian rosewood is astronomically high. But they're using up leftover stock and not getting any more that they can find because they can't seem to find much that has proper certification to please them, that it will pass muster with Customs and Fish and Wildlife Department. And the penalties for having non-certified wood that does not pass inspection for legality are very severe. But a good luthier can adjust thickness of wood to get the right tap tones and can make a very fine guitar out of a variety of different types of wood. We had a Gallagher recently with Osage orange back and sides, and it's a Native American wood that actually can compete very well with rosewood for tone. Walnut can compete pretty well with mahogany for tone. It's a sound that's almost halfway between mahogany and maple, somewhat similar to the tone of koa wood from Hawaii. But Brazilian rosewood is going to continue to be in high esteem, but it's not going to continue to be used in vast quantity because it's not grown on tree farms. In the wild, it does not grow in dense stands of one species. It will have one tree here, and then you may go 1,000 feet away before you find another one, but not dense groves of it. Indian rosewood can be grown on tree farms and on tea plantations where they use it to provide shade for the tea bushes, because the tea plants don't do well in direct sunlight. They do more under the canopy. So the rosewood trees in India can be planted to provide shade for the tea, and then later can be harvested for the wood. At any rate, there's a fair amount of mystique about Brazilian. It's not the only wood that can be used to make a great guitar, but it is as certainly, undoubtedly, as good as any other rosewood. There's no rosewood that I consider to be superior to Brazilian, but is it the only one that can give a superb sound? The answer is no. But Brazilian is hard, dense, and acoustically a very good wood. So it's hard to find anything that's going to be better. But there are other woods, including other species of rosewood, that can do remarkably well and are certainly these days more affordable. John C. says, an archtop acoustic that I recently purchased is described as having a carved select spruce top. There seems to be many conflicting definitions of select spruce. Could you please help explain what is actually meant by select spruce? Well, that's a nice bit of advertising hype as to what select means. I remember in 1957, my father bought a Plymouth car. It was the deluxe model. The deluxe was the bottom of the line. So I don't know what deluxe meant in that advertisement term. Or I got a text this morning from a friend, and I think that it might be applicable to this question: is what does select spruce mean? It says here, benefits of a good vocabulary. I recently called an old engineering buddy of mine, asked what he was working on these days. He replied he was working on, quote, aquathermal treatment of ceramics, aluminum, and steel under a constrained environment. I was impressed until upon further inquiry, I learned that he was washing dishes and silverware with hot water under his wife's supervision. And I don't know what select spruce means. Obviously, it implies it was selected. It might not have been selected to be the best. It might have been selected because it was a good bargain for the manufacturer. I'm not sure. But usually select spruce implies that it's supposed to be very good. But there is not really a wood grading system that is universally accepted, and select spruce with some manufacturers may mean it's really primo stuff, and with others it may not. So it's not something that is numerically quantifiable in that sense. Scott Major asked a hypothetical question. If someone, mythical time traveler in parentheses, had brought you a 2020s Gibson Les Paul R9 to your shop in 1970, how would you have recognized it as a reissue versus an original? Well, needless to say, I'm not aware that a time traveler came in with one. But there's actually multiple facets to that question. In 1970, I didn't know as much about guitars as I do now, and I could have been fooled. On the other hand, if I had a 59 burst in front of me, and I did have 59 bursts back then, they were bringing about $1,000 for a really good one. But if I'd seen the new R9, I would have easily recognized that the case, although similar, is not identical. The tuners, although similar, were not identical. And the workmanship overall is similar, but not identical. But I would have been confused because, one, I didn't know as much. And I know from experience and memory that in 70, I know I didn't know as much as I do today. That's 52 years ago. If I knew as much then as now, that would be a statement that in 52 years, I haven't learned anything new. The quality of fakes in 1970 wasn't so good. It was usually perfectly obvious. Like I used to say that it was easy to tell a refinish from an original finish. If it was factory quality and looked really pretty flawless, that was original finish. If it looked like barn paint applied with a broom, that was a refinish. And there wasn't much in between, at least not that I ever saw back then. But as values went up, it got harder and harder to tell. And I know that the R9, or some of the Murphy aged specials, Of course, if they were really aged to be truly relic, they wouldn't look almost real to me in 1970, because the originals, like a 1960, January 1960, would have been 10 years old when I opened up my shop in January 70. So even a late 59 could be barely over 10 years old when I opened up my shop in 1970, January. So it would be the age that today a 2012 guitar is. Well, we don't think of a 2012 guitar as being especially old, and it shouldn't look beat up necessarily. But the amount of wear depends much more on the player than how old something is. If you take good care of it, you can have an instrument that's 100 years old and looks almost new, or you can have one that's been played for 3 weeks by some people and be scratched up and look mutilated. Could I have been fooled? Yup. Knowing now how much I've learned since 1970, I'd have to admit that I'd recognize that the case was different and I'd be confused by that. But the guitar itself, the new ones that Gibson's making do look very much like the old ones. And I know enough to know that I've learned a lot since 70, and that the quality of the new one is very good. I think I would determine that it's not, something's fishy. I'd be uneasy, but I wouldn't quite know what to think. And I certainly wouldn't be expecting a time traveler. Today, we see occasionally some vintage instruments that are so squeaky clean that it looks like a time machine just brought them back to us. And they look sometimes so clean that people question whether they're real. In fact, I had that happen to me several years ago on a 1958 gold top with humbucking pickups. And I sold it to a rather wealthy client. It was squeaky clean. It looked brand new. And a year later, I found out from one of his employees that he'd been told by several dealers that I'd sold him a fake. And that's why I hadn't heard from him anymore. That guitar was pristine, perfect. And I know absolutely the history of that instrument. I know it was real. But not all dealers have equal knowledge or integrity. And I have no problem admitting that I've learned a lot in the past 52 years, and that I'm much better at evaluating instruments today than I was then. And I was pretty darn good then. But I was good by the standards of 1970 and with the knowledge that was available at the time. And I think that I had very few instances of being fooled by forgeries as far back as 1970. But even by the late 70s, there were some folks like Max who were making some pretty convincing looking copies. And as the values went up, the quality of the fakes went up. And when items like a Flying V or an Explorer can be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, I heard a report of an Explorer recently selling for over $1 million, the incentive to make a forgery is very high, and the quality of the fakes goes up. Every time there's a book or an article giving you point by point things to look for to determine whether one is original or not, some of the first people who check it out are the forgers, and they make sure to study every single thing that is pointed out on how to tell a fake from an original, and make sure that they get each one of those things right from there on. And the quality of fakes when an Explorer was $1,200 in 1970. That's about what I got from Rick Derringer for the forked peghead Explorer he got from me. Versus now, when that guitar would bring hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not a million. The quality of the forgeries went up dramatically when they hit about $50,000, and when they hit $300,000-$400,000 and up, quality of forgeries went up again and again. So say that I've never made a mistake, I can't tell you that. I have at previous sessions commented that it's harder and harder to tell an original custom color Fender from a refinish, at least unless you take it apart and study it under the pick guard. And even Tom Murphy himself, who does the Murphy Lab Gibson finishes, told me the story of going to a guitar show, seeing a candy apple red Stratocaster that looked great from the 60s, priced where he thought he could sell it. He had a friend who wanted one. He bought it, didn't have a chance to take it all apart at the show. But when he got it back home, he wanted to clean the electronics. He took off the pick guard to get at the electronics and found that there was an autograph under the pick guard on the body, scrawled into the finish. The most ironic name that could possibly be, it was his own signature, indicating that it was a refinish job he had done. Guitar had a couple years more of aging, maybe as much as 5 years more, but it had some genuine normal wear and some lacquer checking that was real. And his own finish job fooled him. But the fact is, one of the easiest guitars to make a copy of would be an Explorer or a V. They don't have any fancy inlay. They don't have electronics that you can't get out of a different guitar and put in it. So it does, one needs to be careful. John P. asks if I know anyone who builds solid wood guitar stands that are not holding the guitar up by the neck. And the maker that he had who was doing stands like that died and he doesn't have access. I don't have any names right off, but I know I've seen some at the NAMM shows that are like you're looking for, and they are out there. So I think if you go online and check or call around, that you will find that there are a few makers. I don't instantaneously at this time know the exact names, but I know that there are several out there. We don't stock them at Gruen Guitars, but I know they're available quite readily, and it should not be that hard to find them if you go online and do a search. Jerry Black asks, what musical artist have you not met but want to? Well, obviously there's lots I haven't met. Some of the ones I'd most like to meet, I can't and never will because they are dead. I sure would have liked to meet Charlie Christian or Robert Johnson, Eddie Lang, Django Reinhardt. Are there modern players I'm really just dying to meet and haven't met yet? I get to meet a lot of great players. And almost every day there's somebody coming in who's interesting to meet. I just sort of have to sit, if I stay right here and wait, players come to me. So I can't claim that there's that many that I'm just dying to meet right now, but there's a bunch of ones who musicians who are gone that I wish I could have met. I'm confident that most of the ones today that I really want to meet, I'll have the opportunity, and it likely will happen. I have no intention of retiring anytime soon. I'm 76 now. I'll be 77 August 21st. My great uncle Otto lived to be 105 and didn't retire, but his sister Emma only made it to 102. I hope I'm going to be here for a while, but right now I come in 6 days a week and do fun stuff. And I have a great staff that permits me to concentrate on fun stuff. And that's what I'm going to keep doing. Another one from the same person asks, was I able to attend any of the Newport folk festivals, particularly 63, 4, or any other? And the answer is no. I never went to Newport. I never went to, was not at Woodstock, but I've been to a heck of a lot of concerts and festivals. I've gotten to meet an amazing array of people, musicians passing through Nashville. So, you know, I've met the Stones, and I've met and done a lot of business with Eric Clapton, Vince Gill, Marty Stewart, Ricky Skaggs, people, members of the band Yes, Rick Nielsen, Hank Williams Jr., and it goes on and on and on. I've met lots of them. And I find is some of them are great folks. Some of them are great musicians and not necessarily a personality that I'd ever likely have as a personal friend. But most musicians, by and large, including some of the very highly rated ones, are really genuinely nice, friendly people. And I enjoy their company. But musicians are like people in general. High percentage are great folks, and some are not. But being a nice guy and being a technically proficient player are not the same. There are some extremely fine players who are very quirky personalities that I might not get along with well, but it doesn't mean they're not talented. So I have one from Simon Courtlang. Says at least one Australian is up at 3:10 a.m. listening to George. Hello all. Well, I'm glad I'm so popular. Now, I myself am quite frequently up at 3:10 a.m. I tend to sometimes go to sleep at 9 or 10, wake up at 2 in the morning and maybe be active till 3 or 4, take a nap again, and then go to work. But I don't always sleep 8 hours straight. And it's not at all uncommon for me to be up at 3:10 a.m. People are sometimes surprised at the time of day when they get an email from me, because it can be 3:10 a.m. But I have enough common sense to not send text messages at 3 that are going to wake people up. Sean Geis says, don't forget Generation X. We love Pink Floyd. And what I'll say about Generation X is I've probably made less money off of Generation X than almost any other. But there are obviously exceptions to the rule. And some of the people Generation X love guitars. And I have some very fine customers who are Generation X. But overall, when Generation X was in their earlier buying phase, companies like Martin, Fender, Gibson, Guild, Gretsch, you name it, they were starving. Martin was one of the few that remained independent. Martin and Taylor both still are with the original family. But although Taylor now is actually employee owned as far as shareholders. But the most popular American guitar brand in the early and mid 80s was Kramer, course, actually, it was an American brand, but they were made overseas, but it was still an American brand. It was an American company that did the importing. Pink Floyd crossed generations from baby boomers to X. Many bands did not. And, but X, the period of the late 70s through mid 80s was a very rough time for American guitar makers. Grover Jackson did well. Charvel did well, but those were small companies. Kramer did extremely well. And Gibson, Fender, and Martin were struggling. And Gretsch was struggling. Gretsch basically just folded at that time. Not easy. He asked, same person asked, can you comment on the Martin 1988 D16A Ash side and back with spruce tops? Martin made a series of D16 models. They had an ash model. They had a walnut model. They had a variety of woods. They had forward shifted scallop bracing, solid spruce tops, solid wood back and sides, traditional dovetail joint, completely different from the later style 16s, which are the technology series with different bracing and a different type neck joint. And the early models from the 80s, the D16A, and it was an A and M in mahogany, a W with walnut. Those were very good guitars. They had just very simple single binding, black binding on the top and back, very plain ornamentation, but and they cost less money new than a D18 did at the time, but the bracing pattern was actually better than what a D18. The D18 at that time had non-scalloped rear shifted bracing, and the D16 had the forward shifted scallop. It was actually a better sounding guitar than the D16. And it was about the only thing Martin was making at the time that had forward shifted scallop bracing. Even the HD28 at that time had rear shifted scallop bracing. But those early D16 models with any of the wood they featured were very good guitars. A relative sleeper, really. That most people are not familiar with them, but they were good instruments. And that's something that is, I think, a bit of a sleeper, that when you find one, it's good. On the other hand, today, there's plenty of new Martins that have forward shifted scallop bracing. Standard D18 has it. The HD28 has it. And Martin's making better guitars now, at least in my opinion, than they were 50 years ago. In some ways better even than what they did in the 1960s. The new Martins don't have Brazilian rosewood, but so far as bracing patterns, neck dimensions, intonation, things that really matter on playability and on tone, the new Martins today are very good guitars. And I'd go as far as to say that's true for Fender and Gibson on traditional. And I'd say that while Taylor wasn't around until 1974, the new Taylors today are the best Taylors ever. And they're good. The workmanship from major American manufacturers today is really fine and is worthy of attention. Right now, brand new instruments are often better players, better sounding, and actually a better value than many used instruments that are 50 years old. It's particularly true on acoustics, because a 50-year-old acoustic guitar if it's never been worked on, is likely to need neck set, fret work. If it's a Martin, it may need a plane and refret because they didn't have an adjustable rod in the neck until 1985 on Martin. Bridge reglue, racing reglue, crack repairs, warpage that needs to be addressed. Aside from just wear, it can have virtually no wear. It could have just sat in the case, never played, but left at full tension tuning. And by now it's going to need work as a result. So new instruments, at least the right ones by the right makers, can be very good investments and certainly fine utility instruments. They don't beat, in my opinion, the true golden era guitars like pre-CBS Fenders or McCarty era Gibson Electrics or pre-World War II Gibson Acoustics. But the fact is that the new ones come closer to those standards than anything else in many, many years. And they're good. And definitely good enough that you can take a new instrument on stage and use it professionally, no problem. And in the 70s, we sold lots of vintage instruments, what we called vintage. And today, they weren't really all that old at the time. When I opened up a store in 70, a 30-year-old guitar was 1940. But that was definitely, we viewed that and called it vintage. And we also knew that those things typically needed work, but that they sounded better than the new ones. And it used to be for a professional musician desiring really good sound, they needed a vintage instrument to sound good. And for an amateur who had a discriminating ear, the ones that were really fun to play were not the new ones. Today, I can truthfully say that I get in some new guitars that really impress me. And I'm talking about factory made. And keep in mind that Martins and Gibsons and Fenders, the golden era instruments, were factory made in the first place. The idea that something has to be luthier built by a one-man operation in order to be good simply is not valid. There are plenty of luthier-built instruments that, in my opinion, have very little merit. And there are some that have great merit. Not all makers are the same. Not all musicians are the same. There are some musicians who may not be technically particularly good, but are fabulous entertainers. There are others who are technically incredibly proficient and are totally boring to listen to, but they can do well in a session to be backup. But they don't come up with creative lead work. They don't come up with anything that has real flair or personality. But sometimes all they need in the session is background fill, and they're great at it. They can do things that may be very complex technically, but they don't seem to play with the phrasing or feeling that makes them a star. Same could be said to some extent about instruments. Although instruments to perform well do require a skilled maker, but there are some makers whose work is not necessarily as flawlessly neat and clean as others. D'Angelico and Stromberg made fabulous arch tops, and their workmanship was such that a lot of modern factories would be rejected. The binding's a little sloppy, or the inlay, it's hand cut and nowhere near as precise as the laser cut stuff that we see on many instruments. And even the finish may have some, it's not flawlessly mirror shine, but Guarneri violins, you can see some chisel marks on the scroll. Stradivari's were actually a bit neater and cleaner, but the Guarneris are close, and the Guarneris, as far as sound, are superb. They're every bit as good as the Strad, and some concert soloists prefer a Guarneri. Nothing cuts better than a Guarneri violin in that field. That they're fabulous. Well, guitars can be a bit like that. We have Bill Comber. From Craig Allen, we have, do you have any listening recommendations, bluegrass or otherwise? Thanks in advance. Well, I certainly recommend listening to Vince Gill, Marty Stewart, and one that's lesser known, Norman Blake. Norman Blake is one of my absolute all-time favorite guitar players ever. And also I'd add Doc Watson. The original Carter family, Maybelle Carter, was incredibly influential and one of my all-time favorite players. I was basically probably influenced more by Maybelle and by Norman Blake than almost anybody else. But I've named a few there, and they're good. He also asks, you recently put up for sale 2 new Gallagher guitars, a J50 Jumbo 50 model and a GTN Tennessee model made from Tennessee wood. What is your opinion of the TN model, the Tennessee model? That was a guitar Dreadnought made entirely with native Tennessee wood. It had a red spruce top, and that's from the Smoky Mountains at the higher elevations. It's the same species as Adirondack spruce, great stuff. And the Osage orange back and sides, which I commented previously in this same session today, it sounded great. It was on up with rosewood so far as tone, had a walnut neck. It was a great guitar, and I can say that it is possible absolutely to make a fine sounding guitar with native Tennessee wood. John Lister asks, do I have any information on the Stradalin master mandolin models of the 1930s? There's very little information. I've seen poorly made and well-made master models. Stradalin made basically student model instruments. So even their master model was not a really super high-end instrument, but they sounded surprisingly good. We don't see very many of them, but so far as appearance, they don't look any more sophisticated than some of the harmonies and Ks, but the sound in general was more sophisticated, and they were actually pretty good mandolins. If you send me an email, I can get you more information on Stradalin. I don't have it at fingertips, but Joe Spann at my shop does have plenty of information on Stradalin. So if you email him Joe, J-O-E @GRUHN, and ask him for information about Stradalin, he will be happy to send you some pretty complete information. Steve Blevins asks, how many 1959 Les Pauls do you think are out there? And actually the production information is fairly readily available, but there were about 1,500 Les Paul Sunbursts made from 58 through 1960. And the number of them that are still in good condition is not really all that well documented. There's a fair number of private collections that don't share all the information, but I think it's fair to say that more than half of them are still around and in fairly good condition. Some I've seen were just totally destroyed. And to the point I've seen things like perfectly fine 59 Les Paul that somebody decided to convert to left-handed and did a left-handed cutaway with a hacksaw. That's not great. But most of the 59 Les Pauls are still out there. They're not things that people threw away. And especially once they found out how valuable they are, they take care of them. There's an incentive to do that. But still, there's been some that were totally mutilated, some that are probably destroyed, home fires, whatever. But I'd say that probably at least 3/4 of the ones ever made are still around. And of the ones that are still around, more than half are still in very good condition. Thomas Wayne Lay, last question of the day. What are your thoughts about the American Fender Highway 1 Telecaster? I have a 2003 model. Is it worth keeping? Well, yeah, it was a budget model, USA made, but it was still well made. They play well, they sound good. And actually, since in 2003, it's not a CBS made Fender, I wouldn't be a bit surprised if your 2003 sounds better than most 1970s Strats, some of which today people are spending $4,000 and $5,000 for just because they have nostalgia collectability. I personally don't think much of the CBS model Strats, especially the ones of the 70s, the ones with the 3-bolt necks. If I were getting one to play, I'd probably rather play the Highway 1 than a 1970s Strat that weighs like a boat anchor, has mediocre pickups, and a 3-volt neck system that doesn't stay in tune well. The Highway 1 Strat is a perfectly respectable instrument that you can take on stage or in the studio and use. And if it's good enough for that, it's good enough to play at home and enjoy it too. Fender is providing good bang for the buck. And for that matter, so are Martin, Gibson, Taylor, and a number of other companies. Some of the major manufacturers today are producing some of the best guitars they have in the past half century. And I look forward to more years in the future of being able to deal their instruments. Right now, a lot of the instruments we sell, more than half of the instruments we sell at Grün Guitars today are new. And I didn't used to be proud of the new instruments. And right now I can say that there's a lot of new instruments that I'm very proud to stock. I have no problem recommending them. They're good. I still love vintage. My reputation on vintage has been based very heavily for the shop reputation on vintage, but these days more and more, it's vintage as well as high grade quality new instruments. And I have no problem recommending some instruments by major manufacturers that I feel not only are some of the best they've made in the past 50 years, but compare very favorably to some boutique luthier-built instruments that cost multiples more. Some boutique instruments are great. Some are just ornamental flummadiddles suitable for display in a glass case, but not something I would play. But they're not all the same. And I don't wish to disparage luthier-built instruments. Some of the best of them are fabulous. But just because somebody built it by hand and in a one-man operation does not automatically mean that it's better than a factory-made guitar. If it's the right factory, the right staff, they're great. Anyway, till next week, have a good one. And next week, we'll probably be doing it from the other room, our normal location. But this week, we escaped the jackhammering so that I could talk to you without all of that noise behind me. Have a good one.